Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Pesachim Lamed Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated by Leora Sikemsky for Refuah Shlema for Mordechai Ben Rezel, wishing you a complete and quick refuah. We love you, Leora, David, Ari, Rose, and Elisheva. And by Sharon Russ and Karen Gluch in memory of their father's third Yortzeit, David Ben Avram Zichrono Levarcha. It is exactly 1 year since the Siyum HaShas for women in Jerusalem, where I was so inspired and listened to the first daf on the way home. Our loving father, born and raised in Jamaica, did not have the privilege of a Jewish education. He was a proud, devoted Jew, and his shul became his second home, davening 3 times a day and attending shiurim as often as possible. My hope is to finish Shas Daf Yomi in his memory. Okay, we're going to start now with the end of Lamed Bet Amud Bet. We're going to have to go back, which I guess is good, but we're going to go backwards a little bit just to review and get up to what we're up to so we understand the continuation of the daf. So we saw in the middle of Lamed Bet Amud Bet, I'm not going to start from there, but I'm going to quote from there. We saw this machloket. When you eat truma, again, we're not talking about trumat chametz now. We're just talking about regular truma. You're an Israelite. You're not allowed to eat truma. It belongs only to the Kohen. You eat truma anyway. What happens? It depends how much, right? Are you obligated? First of all, you're obligated death bidei shamayim if you do it on purpose. If it's accidental, you have to add the chomesh. Remember, turn the value plus a fifth. The question is, the Isser Achila, when does it kick in? At what amount? Is it a kazayit? Is it in the realm of what we call Isur Veheter, forbidden eating, things that are forbidden to eat, and then it falls into regular Isurei Achila, the requisite amount is an olive bulk, or that's Tanakama, or Abba Shaul says, no, this is a law of theft. You stole something that's not yours, it belongs to the Kohen, puts us in a different realm, right, of monetary law, where the requirements are Shavet Pruta. Then came Rav Papa and said, well, Abba Shaul doesn't disagree with Tanakami. He's just adding. You need both because it's in both realms. It's not just one, it's both. And therefore you need both Kizayit and Shavet Pruta. Then we had a question on this and kind of knocked it out, that approach. And then we started saying that even Rav Papa changed his mind about this. And this is where it's going to get a little bit difficult. Not difficult, but it's going to be a long while till we actually get to Rav Papa. So we started this yesterday where we brought a braita that quoted the verse about Me'ila. We're not in Truma now. We're moving from Truma to Me'ila. You'll see in a minute or 4 minutes why we're quoting this, what this has to do with anything. So we're starting with Me'ila. Me'ila is misuse of consecrated property, just like with Truma, the law about the Chomesh and all that. And here with Me'ila, there's actually a sacrifice, is only if you did it accidentally, unwittingly, but not if you did it intentionally. It's a case where you probably didn't know that an item was sanctified. So, right, normally items they're not labeled, they don't look any different if you sanctified it. Someone asked at the end of the Hebrew class today, what are you doing with hekdesh in your house, right? Isn't hekdesh stuff for the temple? So I just want to make it clear that you could have hekdesh in your house at any given point. Why is that? Well, when you sanctify an item, you often do it in your house. You say, oh, you know what? I like this couch. I'm going to sanctify this couch to the temple. Now, what does it mean you're sanctifying it? You're not going to schlep the couch to the temple. But what you really mean is I'm giving the value of the couch to the temple. So what do? You redeem it onto a coin and then you bring it to the temple. But or maybe you're going to use it to buy an animal for a sacrifice or whatever it might be you're using it for. But until you redeem it onto a coin, your couch is now sanctified. So it's your couch that's in your house that you use all the time, but it's now sanctified. You can't use it, can't benefit from it until you redeem it. So if you accidentally sit on the couch and use it, right, you're going to be obligated. So now they're going to say, right, well, maybe we'll have to see, but what they're going to say is, so chat'a b'shkaga. It says on the pasuk, shkaga, they derive from here, not mizi, not if it's intentional. So the Gemara questions that drasha and says, why do you even need a drasha? It's obvious. Why is it obvious? We're going to learn from a classic korban chatat that we've learned about many times. Either you eat chalev, or you eat blood, or you eat, right, the chalev is the forbidden fat, or you do something you're chayav on Shabbat. Remember, if you do it unwittingly on Shabbat, you bring a korban chatat. Every time we say chayav meant you're chayav a korban, right, for doing it unwittingly. So all those things, halodinu, umashar mitzvot, other mitzvot shechayev behen karet, that have karet associated with them, and yet poter behen tamizid, they're much more strict because you get karet if you do that, and yet you're exempt if you do it intentionally. So, right, you don't have to bring the korban me'ila, and you don't have to pay the karen and the chomesh. Remember, this is a little tricky because it's a chumrah that we don't let you do that because then you don't end up with atonement. But let's just assume we're saying This has karet. It's strict, and yet it doesn't apply to mezid. So all the more so, me'ila she'en ba karet enodin she'patar tamezid. So me'ila, which doesn't have karet associated with it, it's only death by the hands of God, which I mentioned is a machloket, which we're going to see very soon. But let's assume it has death in the hands of God. Enodin she'patar by tamezid. We're going to assume right now that karet is more severe than death by the hands of God, even though we don't really know, right? They're both death in the hands of God. We don't really know what they each mean. But right now, the Gemara assumes karet we always associate with the most severe. Does that make sense? So they say it would be obvious that you're going to be exempt if you do it intentionally. Kavachomer. So therefore, why do you even need a drasha? Okay. Comes the Braita and answers though. What do you mean? Shar mitzvot, there's no death in the hands of God. It's just karet. And therefore, right, Me'ila has death by the hands of God. That's worse. And therefore, it's a chumrah by Me'ila. And therefore, they say, that's why you need the drasha. So the obvious question on this Braita is, he says, first the Tana said, karet is more severe than death by the hands of God. And then it said, death by the hands of God is more severe than karet. You can't say both, right? And how do you just change in the middle of it? So Amarle, we're going to see ultimately three answers to this question. They're each going to, and I put a chart on the sheet, they're each going to reread the Braita in a different way. Okay, they're going to say the second part of the Braita is not the version. What you see there isn't correct. We're going to give you a different version. And what they're basically each going to do is bring a different chumrah for Me'ila. Basically, they're going to remain with their original, which is karet is more severe than death by the hands of God. And then they're going to say Me'ila has a different chumrah, more so than all the others, and that's why you needed a drasha. But it's the first one that interests us because from the first one, we're going to get into Rav Papa. But again, it's going to take us a little while to get there. We're now going to have a discussion between Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and Rav Chia bar Avin. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak first asks the question, and then he says, right, so then Amar Le, Rav Chia bar Avin says to him, no, did I say it right? Amar Le Rav Nachman Chia bar Avin. Oh, maybe I flipped the people. Okay, so Amar Le, Hachi Kamar. So Rav Chia bar Avin said, I think on my sheet it says the reverse. Hachi Kamar. Lo, im amarta b'shar mitzvot, sheken lo chiyeh behem mita b'pachot mikazayit. Tomar b'milah shechiyeh b'mita b'pachot mikazayit. What do you mean? There's a big difference with shar mitzvot. Shar mitzvot, you're only obligated like chelev and dam. When are you obligated? If you ate a kazayit. They're classic eating kazayit. Whereas me'ilah, you're going to be obligated death even less than a kazayit. Okay, this is eventually going to connect to us because we're talking about your obligation for something less than a kazayit. Now, in our case, it was me'ilah. Remember, it was truma. This is me'ilah. So hold off. So Amalei Tanuach Da'atcha Shinach Da'atei said, thank you for doing this. Now, I can feel good about this. But Amarle, but then the person who gave the answer says back to him, Maini Chuta, wait a minute. I'm taking back what I said. It doesn't really make any sense. To Rabba v'Rav Shesha Chadu Beinaga, they threw an axe at it. They basically knocked down my answer. Okay, whether this happened in the course of one conversation, it seems odd because right, it could be this happened later. He found out later that people knocked out his answer, and therefore it could be. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense how he said something and then said, by the way, they knocked out my answer. Why do you bother bringing his answer in the first place? But let's just put that issue aside. What did they say? They said like this, and it's a little bit of you have to build up the case. Man shamat le da'amal hezi b'mi'ilah b'mita. Notice his argument here. His argument was, right, that you're going to be obligated death even less than a kazayit. Now, I told you it was a machloket, whether me'ilah is obligated death or not. It never says in the Torah that there's death by me'ilah. In fact, it never even says that it's forbidden to misuse consecrated property. All it says is, Ish kim yim'ol ma'al ba'Hashem. If you are to do it, this is what you have to do. So it never actually says that you're obligated. It never says it's forbidden, and it never says you get death for it. So who's the one who says you get death for it? It's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Ditanya, how do we know this? It says in the Braita, Hezi b'mi'ilah, Rebbe omer b'mita, the Chachamim omrim ba'azhara. Rebbe says it's by death, and the Chachamim say it's just a warning. In other words, you shouldn't do it, but there's no death associated with it. You don't get punished by death for misusing consecrated property. So my Tamid Rebbe, right? This would be if you did it intentionally, you get the death penalty, obviously. So my Tamid Rebbe. So what's the reason for Rebbe? Amar Rabbi Aval, Gamal chet mitruma. Finally we get back to truma. He learns it from what we call Gzera Shava. What's Gzera Shava? Gzera Shava is when we have two words that appear the exact same root in two different places. So because it appears here and it appears there, you have to have a tradition that about Gzera Shava. You can't just make one up and say, oh, look, this word. But there were traditions about them. So he has a tradition, Rebbe, that says, it says chet by truma, it says chet by me'ila, ma truma b'mita, af me'ila b'mita. Now, let's go back. What did he say? He said, what's the chumrah about me'ila? The chumrah about me'ila is that there's death even for eating less or for using less than a kazayit. Okay, so now, right, let's say you ate something that was consecrated. You'd be obligated less than a kazayit. So now, if it's learned out from truma, maybe you can see where this is going, umina. If already Rebbe's the one who's the author here, because he's the one who holds me'ila is death, so the braita would then be according to him. But ma truma b'kazayit, af me'ila b'kazayit. But if he holds the Gzera Shava, okay, that's the word umina, and from there, the next step would be to say, just like truma is b'kazayit, like Tanakama says, right? Also me'ila is b'kazayit. Now, what did he say? Me'ila is even less than a kazayit you're obligated. If he's going to learn it from truma, it doesn't make sense to learn it from truma because truma is big kazayit. You're not obligated for less than kazayit. Now, unless you're Abba Shaul, right? So now, Abba Shaul, the whole question is, does Abba Shaul hold also kazayit and also shavapruta? If he holds both, then that would be a good question, right? It would be a question according to both. We could say Rebbe could hold either like Abba Shaul or like Tanakama. Both require a kazayit, which means Rebbe really doesn't make any sense. And that's his question on him. Okay, so he says that's why Rabbah and Rav Sheshet knocked out the shita because it doesn't make any sense. But now, Maskefla Rav Papa, here comes the important part. If Rav Papa held that Abba Shaul also required kazayit, then this question would be fine. There'd be no question on the question, right? Because both hold that you need a kazayit, which means that Rebbe makes that argument in the Braita that we're attributing to Rebbe would make no sense. Because again, if he holds, you get death from Me'ila, it's because he learns it out from Truma. Well, then you'll learn out the Shir also from Truma, and you'll be obligated only at a kazayit. So comes Rav Papa and he says, Matkevla Rav Papa, what kind of a question is this? Mimai de Rebbe ke Rabbanan sfirale. Why are you assuming that Rebbe would say we're going to learn from Truma kazayit, Me'ila kazayit? You could say, Dilma ka Abba Shaul sfirale. Maybe he holds like Abba Shaul that it's Shavat Pruta and it's not kazayit. You already see here, right? Da Amar yesh ba Shavat Pruta af agav de lepe kazayit. He says it has to have a Shavat Pruta. Even if it doesn't have a kazayit, you're still going to be obligated, which means that there is me'ila less than a kazayit if you were to go by Abba Shaul. So he says, why are you assuming he holds like Rabbanan? Maybe he holds like Abba Shaul, and then this Braita would make sense. Now, what do you notice here? Ha Rav Papa hu da Amar da Abba Shaul tartabai. Rav Papa was the one who said before, he himself said he needs both Shavat Pruta and kazayit, which means that his question makes absolutely no sense according to what he said earlier. So therefore, must be elashmamina hadrabeya. Must be that Rav Papa changed his mind and eventually understood that Abba Shaul is only saying Shavat Pruta and not kazayit. Otherwise, this Braita would make no sense, and he thinks the Braita makes sense according to this reading because he does think Me'ila could be less than a kazayit, even if you're going to learn it from Truma, because again, Abba Shaul thinks Truma could be less than an olive bulb, as long as it has the value of a coin, right, a pruta. So we've proven now that Rav Papa changed his mind. But since we brought this up, right, that was all connected to the Machloket Abba Shaul and Tanakama. Now we're totally veering from our topic. We brought up this Braita. We raised a question on the Braita. We had an answer that was rejected. Rav Papa kind of reinstated it, but we're going to now have two other answers to the Braita. Basically, each answer is going to change the second part that rejects the Kal V'chomer and say in the end, Me'ila is really more strict. And each one's going to bring a different stringency that there is a Me'ila that could be the possible end of this Braita, which again, what was the concept of the Braita? Why do you need a verse to tell you? Why do you need a drasha from the pasuk to tell you Me'ila is only unwitting and not intentional? Can't you learn it from a Kal V'chomer from other Isurim? from other forbidden items. And then we say no, because those forbidden things that you're obligated to sin offering and you're only obligated shgaga have some sort of leniency that doesn't exist by Me'ila. Me'ila has its own stringencies. So we're going to see two other answers. Mar b'rei d'Rav Nama. Hachikama. This is the way you read it. Lo, im amarta b'shar mitzvot shelo asa behem she'en mitkaven ki mitkaven. Remember this? Davar she'eno mitkaven, Rabbi Shimon. If you do something and you're not intending to do a forbidden act, but you do it anyway, right? Like, for example, she'im nitkaven lachtoch et hatalush v'chatach et hamechubar, it's Shabbat. You intend to cut a cucumber that's on the ground. You think it's detached from the ground, but as you cut it, you realize it's attached to the ground. So you intended to cut, but what you intended to cut was a cucumber that was detached from the ground, which of course, right, we cut up salad all the time on Shabbat. But you didn't realize that it was actually attached to the ground. Because it's attached to the ground, what happens? You've now cut something off right from the ground. You've detached it. That's kotzer. That's cutting. So in that case, you'd be patur. Remember, Melecha Machshevet Asra Torah. And even in other Isurim, we're going to see that it's also, if you don't have intention, remember we saw Rabbi Shimon also came up in other sugyot as well. We hold by Rabbi Shimon, Davar she'eno mitkaven is patur. So, Tomar b'mi'ilah, but you can't say the same for mi'ilah. Mi'ilah, that's not true. She'im nitkaven litchamen b'gizei chulin. You tried to warm up with wool that was chulin. V'nitchamen b'gizei olah, but instead you warmed up using wool that was for a korban olah, designated for an olah, burnt offering. Shema'al, you'd be obligated. And there's no such thing by me'ilah as, oh, I wasn't intending to do something forbidden. It doesn't matter. You misused consecrated property. It's forbidden no matter what. So therefore, there's a chumrah by me'ilah that isn't by all the other mitzvot. And that's why, again, that would come to explain the second part of the Braita, why you need the drasha. Next, third answer. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, right, altogether three answers. We're now having two others besides the first one that we started with. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Hachi Kama. This is the way you should say it. Lo, ima marta, again, lo is always the rejection of the original kavachomer. Imam Marta b'shar mitzvot, and this is very similar to the other one, but it's a bit of a different twist on it. Shekein lo mitchayev bahem she'ein mitasek ki mitasek. One who is not mitasek is not treated like a mitasek. Now, what's a mitasek? We're going to see right now. She'im, if you remember this, we learned it also in Masechet Shabbat. She'im nitkaven lahagbiya et hatalush. Let's say you intended just to lift the cucumber off the ground, which you weren't even intending to cut. The Rav she'eno mitkaven is, I was intending to cut. And I mean, it could be other cases, but in this case, I was intending to cut. I just thought it was detached, and it turned out it was attached, right? And detached is permitted, attached is forbidden. But here, you weren't even intending to cut. You were just intending to lift something. Now, lifting isn't even you didn't even try to do the act of cutting. But what happened? As you lifted, you ended up uprooting it from the ground. You were just trying to lift it up. And probably you thought it was detached. And it turns out it was attached. And as you lifted it up, you ended up pulling it out of the ground. So in that case, patul, again, for Shabbat, you're going to be patul because it's davar she'eno mitkaven. It's mitasek, right? You weren't even trying to cut it. You were trying to do something else. And in the process, you did something that's forbidden on Shabbat. There, you're going to be exempt. But tomar b'mi'ilah, but the parallel for mi'ilah, you're actually going to be obligated. What would be a case? Shemushit yado l'klili tol chayfetz. You put your hand in a bowl to take something out. Okay, or in a basket or whatever it is in, you put your hand in to take something out, and it turns out there was oil in there that was sanctified, and your hand ended up getting the oil rubbed into your hand, you benefited from the hekdesh, and shema'al, you're going to be obligated in me'ilah. So therefore, this is going to be a problem, okay? Yes, it's muktzah if it's attached. I see your question, Tova. Yes, it is muktzah. That's for sure the case. So yeah. So anyway, but that's not their issue. They're trying to deal with, first of all, muktzah is only d'Rabbanan, right? This is d'oraita. It's also nolad, it wasn't prepared for Shabbat. But the issue here is really we're talking about being tolesh. That's the real, which is a toladav kotzel. Amar mar. Okay, now we're done with this sugya. We brought this in all because we were dealing with Rav Papa and Rav Papa's understanding of Abba Shaul. We wanted to say he rejected what he said before, and that really we end up with these two ideas that one looks at it in terms of an Isur Achila, and then the rules of Achila come in, and the other views it as an issue of theft, okay, financial issues. and therefore he forbids it for that, right? And then the Shavat Pruta is the amount. Okay, so two different, it's very interesting conceptually in terms of how they viewed eating truma. Are you stealing from the Kohen, or is it the fact that it's sanctified in some way and it's something forbidden foods to you? Okay. Now we're moving backwards. Okay, we're going back to what we saw yesterday. If you remember, there was a Braita that we quoted about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Remember, they had this whole debate, and then we saw also Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and Rabbi Eliezer Chasama. They also had that debate at the end of the Braita with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, okay, and Rabbi Akiva. We had this whole discussion about, right, what Hana'ah is there, right? It was Natam Kohen et HaKodesh, right? It has to be Davar HaRa'oi Liot Kodesh. Anyway, they have this whole debate. At the end of the debate between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbi Akiva, it says the following words. So we're now going back to that. Amar Mar means we're quoting something we said earlier, and we're going to go in depth about it, into it. This is only true if you designated truma and it was valid truma, and then it leavened, okay? But aval hifrish chametz truma, and then you have the issue. Remember, chametz b'Pesach. Does it have monetary value? Do we go by the value? Do we go by the weight, right? Even though it's not worth anything, it still weighs something. It still has, or measurement, volume, right? It's still something. So you'd have to pay it back. Or is it chametz b'Pesach right now and it has no value whatsoever because no one can do anything with it, and therefore it's valueless and you don't have to pay anything. So now, this discussion is only in a case where it was truma and then it leavened. But hifrish chametz truma, if you designated the truma when it was chametz, then divrei hakol eina kedosha. Everybody agrees this isn't even truma. It's not sanctified at all. There's no issue. It's useless what you did. If you took chametz and designated it as truma, something leavened, and then you separated truma for the Kohen, that's useless. That's not truma at all. So, minna hanimile, where do we get this from? We're going to have two different sources, both coming from the same drasha and the same pasuk. The pasuk is Reshit digancha tiroshcha v'yitzarecha, the first of your crops, right? Your grains, your tirosh, wine, right? Grapes, and yitzarecha, your olives. Right, those were the three main foods that they ate those days. The reshit gez tzoncha titein lo. Okay, and the first of the shearings of your sheep go to the Kohen. So first they're going to darshan titein lo, give it to him. Now, what's the whole purpose of truma? It's so that the Kohen has food to eat. The Kohanim didn't have their own fields; they need food to eat. So comes the drasha and he says, "Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, amakra titein lo v'lo leuro." It's not for him to have light in his house. Okay, in other words, if you give him truma that's chametz, that's useless for anything, right? Or let's say it's truma tme'ah that you can burn. Now, what they're assuming here about chametz is he's saying even if you hold like Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says chametz you can benefit from, because normally we say you can't. But let's say you hold like Rabbi Yossi Aglili and think that you can benefit from chametz on Pesach. The only thing you'd be able to do with this chametz is burn it. If the Kohen can only burn it, that's not truma. You can't give him something that's only worthy of burning. You have to give him something that he can eat. So they say, wait, is that really true? Mativ Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua, ein tormim min atme'ah ala teorah. What does that mean? This means, remember I said yesterday, you can't take lemons on oranges, right? If you have a pile of lemons, a pile of oranges, you can't take some lemons. Let's say you don't like lemons as much. I'll take my lemons and give them all to the Kohen. I'll save myself all the oranges. You can't do that. Lemons on lemons, oranges on oranges. Likewise, if you have truma produce that's tameh, impure already, which again, the Kohen can't do anything with it other than burn it and use it for fire. So if you have truma tme'ah and you have crops that are tameh and crops that are tahor, you can't say that are pure. You can't say, I'm taking the impure ones, I'll give that to the Kohen, and that will cover my pure ones. Okay, again, you can't mix and match. If you happen to have crops that are all tameh, so you take a little bit of the tameh and that, right, the rest is fine. If you have the tahor ones, you take a little bit of the tahor and it resolves for you the rest of it, right? The rest is allowed. But you can't take tameh on your tahor. But if you did, okay, we're going to read this inside. V'im taram, let's say you did it anyway. You didn't know, or for whatever reason, you did it anyway. Bishogeg, right? Accidentally, unwittingly. Truma, right? Let's say you didn't know it was tameh and you did it. So trumato truma, it's effective. Now, you would say, according to the drasha, titein lo v'lo le'uro, Amai, lema lo velo le'uro. That shouldn't be truma at all. Just like we said, the chametz truma is not truma. This also isn't truma because the kohen has nothing to do with it other than burn it and use it for light or for burning something. So they say lo kash, these are two different cases. Truma tamea is not the same as chametz. Why? And we're going to question, is this really the case? But right now they say, hatam haitalo shata kosher, hacha lo haitalo shata kosher. Now, it's a big question, which is which. So, truma tme'ah, that was impure, originally was pure. Then what happened? And as it had to have been, because when it's attached to the ground, it can't even become impure. What has to happen? You detach it from the ground, liquid has to come upon it, and then it can become impure, which means that at some point after you cut it off the ground, right, cut it from the ground, it was pure. So if that's the case, it had the capability of being okay at some point. So while it's true that now it's tameh, we're going to say if you did it anyway, it's effective because it did have a time where it was effective. This is something we used earlier, this idea of haitalo shata kosher. So this would be considered different if at some point it was permitted. Whereas chametz bepesach never had a shata kosher. You might think, what do you mean it didn't? Before it became chametz, right? Something has to leaven along the time. So now we're going to say, what exactly are you talking about that it didn't have a shata kosher? So the answer, what does it mean? It was never. When it's attached to the ground, that's not even considered. We're only talking about once it was detached. So we must be talking about wheat that leavened while it was attached to the ground. That's a bit of an odd case, right? A bit of a rare case that would happen. But avalachmitz betalush hachinami dekacha. So they're now saying if it first you attach it from the ground, then it leavened, then you were mafresh the truma, right? It's all happening on Pesach. Then it would be effective because again, it had a shata kosher. So that's a question. He's saying, are you trying to say that would then, didn't we just say it's only hifrish chametz truma divrei hakol eina kedosha? So you're going to say it's only the case where it became leavened when it was on the ground? So he says, Amar La'in, yeah, in fact, I think it's true. That line doesn't apply to chametz that had a shata kosher. It was fine. You picked it. It was not leavened. Then over time it leavened, and then you decided to take it as truma for the kohen. That would actually be effective, just like the truma tme'ah. That's his answer. And to strengthen his answer, even though this doesn't really strengthen it, but he says, Bigzerat irim pitgama ubemamar kadishin she'elta. It's a quote from Daniel. It says, what I'm saying is coming from the mouths of the angels, and holy mouths have spoken this. And in the Beit Midrash, they say, like me, this is comparing the Talmidei Chachamim, the scholars, to angels. And it's saying, basically, I have the support of the angels on what I'm telling you, and this is the case. So what he basically does is when it says, back to the beginning, if, right, you were mafresh the chametz, you were mafresh it when it was chametz, it's only if it was chametz before it even got detached from the ground, where it never had a shata kosher, then it wouldn't be truma, anything else would be. But now, that's one answer. Ki ata Rav Huna b'reid Rav Yoshua, Amal, he gives a different pasuk, because he really doesn't think this is a good proof. Okay? Lo v'lo la'oro doesn't really stand the test because of the truma tme'ah, that b'di'eved, if you did it anyway, it would be effective. So here also, you should say the same. The shata kosher is a very weak distinction because it only ends up in a very rare case where something leavened while it was attached to the ground. So he gives a different answer. He says, Amar Kra, Reshit. I told you they're both going to darshan this verse, just he darshans the beginning of it. Reshit means the first. Now, first means there's a second, right? Not only does it mean there's a second, what it means is take the first of your produce and the rest, the assumption is, Shishiyareh hanikarim. That means it permits something else to you. When you take the first, it means the rest of it becomes permitted to you. So now, sorry, I didn't read that next word. This is a case where if you take it when it's chametz, what will happen? You're going now. When it's tme'ah, it doesn't matter because you have no issue with tme'ah and torah, and that's irrelevant. But when you take truma that's chametz and it's Pesach, and you separate it on Pesach, and you are left with the rest, and the rest is also chametz, that's not permitted to you in any way. So that's not truma. For truma to be effective, it's very interesting perception. What it's saying is it's not just about giving a gift to the Kohen. It's about your whole, everything you have is forbidden. When you give it to the Kohen, that's going to permit the rest to you. And in this case, without that second part, it's not considered truma. Without having some aspect that's permitted to you, it's not valid. It's not valid truma. And that's a different explanation as to where it comes from. And there's no questions on that. Okay. Now we're moving to a different topic. We're switching topics a little bit. It's also connected to that same braita, and that's why this comes up, of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbi Akiva. If you remember, one answer that Rabbi Akiva said back to him was that look at grapes and mulberries. They can't, if they're truma that becomes impure, you can't do anything with them because you can't burn them. So because of that, you can't burn them, and therefore, right, they're useless, and they're just like chametz on Pesach. And he tries to use that to prove his point. Anything that's forbidden by hana'ah, right? And that's his, he compares them. Okay, now, what happens here? So we're now going to get into grapes and the juice, and we're going to talk about, there's a whole different discussion about tumat ochlin. If your Hebrew's good and you want to listen to Gefet, there's a whole famous machloket here, which I'll mention while we're learning, that comes out of this sugya, or at least also of this sugya. But the real question here is a question of a conceptual framework about how to understand liquid that's contained inside a fruit. So when you have grapes and there's juice inside, is that juice part of the grape, okay, which is probably what you would think about, or is that juice a separate entity? And there's juice inside, there's something that's protecting it inside, right? The outside of the fruit, which is not the same as the inside. And when you take it out, you're just taking out something that's separate. It's a separate entity. And then it comes out. Okay. We talked about this a little bit with Schita and Shabbat, about squeezing things, and that it's a toladad mifarek, like taking out the grain, the kernel from the separating the wheat from the chaff, right? That there's something inside something else. Okay. And that maybe we view it like that and not that it's all one entity. Now, why is that going to be relevant? Let's say the outside of the grape becomes tameh. Is everything inside the grape tameh or not? Okay, so Rav Acha bar Avia, Yativ Rav Acha bar Rav Avia kamei de Rav Chisda. He was sitting in front of Rav Chisda. V'yativ va'amar mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. He said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Anavim shenitmeu. If you have grapes that became impure, dorcham pachot mikibetza, v'yenan kasher l'nisachim. The first thing you have to know is the shear for ochel, for becoming, well, now this is the big fill in the blank. For tuma, I'll just say it very generally right now, is a kibetza. Food, the shear of tuma is kibetza. There's a big machlok at Rashi and others about whether that means to become tameh, or Rashi thinks based on a midrash halacha from Torah Kohanim, he believes that it's to become tameh, it can be any size. For food to become tameh, we've talked about this machloket before. For food to become impure, it could be any size is impure. But to pass on tuma to something else, it has to be a kibetza. It's right to, maybe it's okay to absorb, right? This is a good conceptual idea. To absorb something, it's very easy to absorb, but to be able to pass it on to someone else, it's not as easy, right? Take a shir daf yomi, right? You might be able to listen and get some ideas, but to pass it, to go explain it to someone else might be a little more complicated. So the question is the shir of a kibetza also to become impure or only to pass on impurity? And that affects how you read the sugya, but I'm not going to get into all those details. That's a whole different thing, but we'll just try to explain it basically. But again, connect the idea of kibetza with tuma. So, anavim shenitmu, grapes that became impure, dorchan pachot mikibetza. So what can you do? You can take less than a kibetza amount of grapes. Now, this fits in well with Rashi. What do you want to do now? What happens when you take the juice out? The liquid will come in contact with the grape. If the grape doesn't have a kibetza in it, right? There's not enough grapes of a kibetza together, then the size of an egg, then what will happen? As it comes out, right? It won't become impure. This is assuming that it wasn't impure to begin with, right? So let's just read. And the yenam, any wine that comes out is kasher l'nisachim. You could even put it as wine libations on the altar. It's so pure. Okay, there's no problem at all. Alma kasever, he must hold. Okay, still, we don't know how this connects yet. We're only going to eventually get back to the tutim and the anavim that we talked about yesterday, but we'll get back to that only later. So he must hold mashke mifkap kide. It's like they're just being protected inside this grape, I can't think of the word, the outside of the grape. And, right, la'emat kamitamu. So when does it become tamei? It didn't become tamei in the first place. It's just kind of protected inside here. Not when the outside becomes tamei, the inside doesn't. And therefore, when does it become tamei? L'chisachet lehu. When it comes out of the grape, right? When you squeeze it. And l'chisachet lehu leite l'shirei. And as you're squeezing it, you don't have enough of a shear to pass on the impurity. So they say, wait a minute. Ihachi kibetsanami. If that's the case, you could even use grapes. It doesn't have to be less than an egg. It could be even an exact size of an egg. Why is that? An egg usually does pass on impurity, but we're going to see right now. This is like a funny way of looking at it. Tahatnan, it says in the Mishnah, tamemeit. If you have someone who's an impure because they came in contact with a dead body, shesachat zeitim va'anavim kibetza mechuvenet. If they're squeezing olives or pressing olives or squeezing grapes, exactly the size of a beitza, Tilorin, what comes out of there is pure. Why is it pure? So why they don't say this? Because as soon as you start squeezing, what happens? You squish the size of the grape. It's no longer a kibetza. As the juice drips out, you already have less than the shear. So if you start with an exact shear of one egg, as you compress it, it immediately gets smaller, right? It's compressed, and then you won't have a kibetza anymore. So therefore, your case, you should have also said a kibetza. So he says, oh no, that's not a question. Because remember, they said less than a beitza. So he says, that's not a proof against me because hatam diavid hachalechatchila. That was a case where he did it already. Then we're going to say it's okay. But we're not going to say, go for it and take even a kibetza and squeeze out the juice. Why? This is our classic. We're worried that people will make mistakes, right? If we tell you exactly the size of an egg, right? People don't measure 100% exactly, and you might end up using a little more than a kibetza. And therefore we say less, so that if you err a little bit, you'll end up with a kibetza, and that'll be okay. So he says, that doesn't knock out my shita. But in any case, Rav Chisda is going to come along and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Amalei Rav Chisda, man siet lachol Rabbi Yochanan Rabach. Who listens to you and Rabbi Yochanan, your rabbi? And as you're quoting this name of Rabbi Yochanan, I don't know what you're talking about. He says, what are you talking about? The grape became tamei. The grape includes everything in the grape. So when you squeeze out the juice, the tumah just disappears, evaporates. What happened to all that tumah? So he says it can't possibly be. Alma kasavar must be that he holds Rav Chisda mashkin mivla blie. And this is what I said. There's a conceptual difference. He says the mashkin are part of the grape. It's not that there's grape skin and that's separate from the inside of the grape. No, the juice is part of the grape. And therefore he thinks you can't squeeze out this juice. It doesn't work. Once the grape became tamei, also whatever was in the grape became tamei, impure. So Amalei, they say to him, what do you mean? And they're going to use the source they just used and says, look, it said here. There you see exactly that. How else could they be tahor? Forget about the shiur and the amount and all that, but how could they be tahor if a tamei came in contact with them? If you say they're just kind of like a pikadon being watched inside, they're a separate entity, then you would say that's why you can squeeze the juice out. But how could they possibly be pure? So he switches the issue. He says this must be an issue. It must be those grapes, once they were picked, they never came in contact with the liquid. Now, Emat mikashre. When did they come in contact with the liquid? Now, as soon as you start squeezing out the juice, what happens? They start getting wet. As soon as they get wet, what's the problem? They no longer have a kibetza anymore. So if they were exactly an egg, and when they start getting wet, right? As soon as they start getting wet, they no longer have the amount that's capable of passing on impurity. So kisachet lehu batzir lehu shira. As soon as you squeeze them, already they no longer have a shear anymore, and they're not going to be, again, they're either not going to become tamei or they're not going to be able to pass on impurity. De'ilo temahachi, because if you don't say that, we're finally getting back to our topic. Haditanya, look at the bright. Halimazid domeh. What is this like? What did Rabbi Akiva say? It's like trumat tutim ba'anavim shenitma'a she'ein lo ba lo heter achila v'lo heter hasaka. Now, what did we say about these? There's no way to permit them. What do you mean there's no way to permit them? If you're allowed to squeeze them and get the juice out and the juice isn't impure, then this is, right, it was truma that became tme'ah, and we said there's nothing you can do with them. But according to what the first person said, right, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, What do you mean? You can tread on them less than a kibetza. The juice will come out. They are worthy of something. So why did he bring it as a proof that you can't use these at all? So Rava says that's not a question on him. Why? Amar Rava, gzera dilma atibehu lidei takala. It could be that we don't want you leaving. Once the anavim and the tutim, the mulberries and the grapes became impure, what are we worried about? If you leave them around, okay, this goes back to what we said about Me'ilah. People sometimes don't know that something's consecrated. It doesn't look any different just because it's consecrated. This doesn't look any different just because it became impure. In fact, in halacha, they call it, if I take a Kohen stuff and I cause it to be impure, I cause damage basically. But it's called hezek she'eino nireh. It's damage that you can't see. It's in a different category of damages. It's not like I broke his utensil where you see it's broken. Here it has a different status, but it looks exactly the same. Because it looks the same, people might confuse it. If you leave around, you say, oh, well, these grapes and mulberries can be used because they're not actually, right? There's some way you can use them by squeezing less than a kibetza at a time and getting the juice out. And then it would be worthy of something. But it doesn't matter because if you leave those laying around, people won't know and they'll think they can use them for it's truma torah, and they'll use them. And we talked about this issue before. So now the Gemara is going to go into this issue a little bit. Are we really worried about this? The Hatanya, again, pull out a source. What does the source say? You can light up a fire with bread or with oil of truma that was impure, which means that you obviously can leave them laying around for the next time you need to make a fire. So why here do they have no value? And those do have value. Again, these have value not because you can burn them, but you can squeeze the juice out of them. So Amarle, Pat Zarek Lebenitzim, Shemen Shel Truma, Ramele B'Kli Ma'us. We saw this actually before about at least the oil. The oil they were put in a disgusting utensil. So everyone knew the disgusting utensil, right? That has the oil that's impure. And the bread they threw and they put it right next to all the wood that they were going to use for firewood. So again, everybody knew no one was going to end up eating it. So now that we're going to go gufa into that, so Abaye Amar Mishmei Techizkiya v'Rava Amar Debei Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Marta Amar Rav Huna. Okay, both Abaye and Rava agree in this case. Lo shanu ela pat. This, by the way, is only bread. Why? When you throw bread outside, what will happen? It'll become disgusting. No one's going to end up accidentally eating it. But wheat, you can't, because if you throw wheat with the firewood, someone could come along and use the wheat. The wheat doesn't get ruined. It's hard kernels. Shema yavo b'hem lidei takala, right? Chitim, you might actually come and take them from there. It's not the location. It's the fact that once you throw it outside, it's going to get ruined. But the wheat won't. And Rabbi Yochanan amar filu chite. So Rabbi Yochanan says even wheat. So they question Rabbi Yochanan amai. Why are we not worried? So they say, well, Rabbi Yochanan said it was okay. It's a problem. Sorry, right? It's okay to use the wheat, even to throw the wheat there. Amar Rav Ashi, it must be like Rav Ashi said somewhere else, which we'll get into tomorrow, where the somewhere else is. Bishlikata u'mi'isata. He says somewhere else. He explains it must be where you cook them and then they became disgusting. Hachanami bishlikata u'mi'isata. In other words, it's not hard kernels. It's kernels that were already cooked, and then right there you leave them outside, they're going to become disgusting. That's when you can leave them with the fire, when you don't have to worry anyone's going to eat them. They'll know that they're only for burning. But if they were really hard kernels, even Rabbi Yochanan wouldn't say that it's okay. That's at least how they explain Rabbi Yochanan. So we ended with this concept that we keep coming back to many times in this Masechet about when should you be concerned about people making mistakes, when yes, when no, what kind of things can we put in place to ensure that people don't err, and therefore, they might not permit something that normally would be permitted. So that's it for today. Have a great day.